learners. Welcome to the 26th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century English novel, where we are looking at the work of a select group of women writers. I have provided a somewhat detailed biographical introduction to the figure Zora Neale Hurston. I'll now talk briefly about the kind of writing Hurston was doing as an anthropologist, the kind of things she learned and wrote about, and how this writing shapes the kind of narrative figure that would tell the stories of Janie Crawford in The Eyes Were Watching God. Now, Hurston's first field trip to the American South was in 1927, and by her own judgment, it was a failure. In her autobiography, Hurston describes the primness with which she talked in a language that she calls Bernardese, referring to Barnard College in Columbia University. And it revealed nothing but privilege and a sort of instrumental reason by which privileged English-speaking intellectual expresses a desire to extract the stories and the culture of poor Black people in order to further the career of the writer. Shortly after this, and after Hurston had exhausted the first tranche of funds to travel, she met Mrs. Osgood Mason, who was a very typical figure, that is, a white Park Avenue enthusiast of Negro culture. And this person, Mrs. Mason, gave her a lot of money, but also made her sign a contract that she would possess a copy of the first write-up that Hurston produced. Nonetheless, Hurston really fully embraced this role as a mission, took on this crusade to, as one scholar puts it, scrape the blackface from folk culture, to extricate it from layers of stereotype and scorn, to let it breathe. Now, this is important. What is Black culture? The very word Black, right? The very description of an identity or a cultural practice as being Black or African American. What is the fundamental assumption that is betrayed when we use these words as adjectives? I mean, I've been using these words, Black and African American, interchangeably. I'm, of course, following conventional usage, but what does this convention reveal? It reveals that the dominant center of this intellectual universe is not Black. And because from this dominant white cultural center, there's only one thing that appears to be defining this culture, and that is its Blackness, the fact that it is practiced by people who have Black skin. And while there may be no bad intentions, I mean, we may not be like King Leopold, who is extracting resources from Conrad's Congo. But at the same time, we inhabit the perspective in which whiteness is dominant. And Hurston was very aware of that domination, of that perspective, and it's, if not aggressive, then definitely very muted and very pervasive and somewhat unconscious white supremacist logic. And in her own way, Hurston sought to challenge or trouble somehow that unconscious white supremacist logic. And one way in which she thought she could do that was by, as the scholar puts it, scraping the Black face from folk culture. Some of you may have heard of blackface. Blackface is a practice in which white people, mostly, it started off as a racist southern white thing, but it was also practiced by many well-meaning so-called intellectuals and scholars. Blackface is a practice in which white people or non-Black people would paint their faces in a darker shade and would play certain roles. They would pretend to be Black people. Mostly it was done in a derogative way, but also it was also done because in segregated and pre-abolitionist times, Black people were not allowed to perform certain roles, perform in public, for instance. And therefore, it became quite convenient. But even after abolition and even after it was possible to get Black actors, many people still enjoyed performing blackface in private. A few years ago, there was a major controversy, a controversy for literary scholars, and I think for some readers who held somewhat idealistic notions of their favorite writers. But nonetheless, the controversy stemmed from the fact that there were pictures that were discovered of the British modernist writer Virginia Woolf wearing blackface and performing for a family audience. I mean, it was a well-meaning, very innocent, fun performance. But nonetheless, blackface has very strong connotation of social and racist violence. It has to do with the annihilation of a certain kind of identity and the suppression and the absolute silencing of a particular kind of cultural perspective. So, blackface, even at its best, right? If we can all assume that nobody wants to be actively racist, for instance, Virginia Woolf and her cousins who were wearing blackface and performing a family play, a closet drama, there was nothing overtly racist in that use of blackface. But nonetheless, blackface tends to assume that black folk culture is something that is strange, is something that is practiced by a certain kind of people who happen to be black, and it has to be written about, explained, and caricatured by white people in order to be understood. This is the assumption. And in Hurston's earliest attempts, her training as an anthropologist, Hurston, I believe, began to see the potential to challenge blackface. And this is why the expression, she tried to scrape the black face from folk culture. That is, she tried to write about the things that these poor black people were doing, but to write about them in a way that did not repeat this derogatory assumption that they were ignorant or they were poor or they had nothing else to do, or it was inevitable that, driven by poverty and suffering, these poor black people would eventually start to act in funny ways. So it was this assumption, very derogatory, and an assumption that actually denies the humanity of people who do certain things in order to simply survive. And so, while it may be true that people are surviving, it is still important to pay attention and to learn to observe as carefully as one can, and then try to understand how they are surviving, instead of simply saying that they're just doing this to survive. Franz Boas's thoughts, Franz Boas's anthropology inspired Hurston to undertake this very sympathetic act of paying attention to the practices of a particular community in order to produce a way of thinking and writing about that community, which emerged from within a way of living and which closed the distance, which did not replicate this assumption that these people acted in this way because they were black and they were poor and they had nothing better to do, because obviously, because of centuries of violence and slavery, they couldn't really afford an education or civilization. So the stereotypical narrative of suffering seems to dehumanize the individuality of folk culture. And it was to challenge this dehumanization that Hurston took inspiration from Franz Boas's anthropology. Now, Mules and Men was the first work of folk tales. It was a work of anthropology which basically collected a lot of stories that Hurston had heard from people during her travels in the southern states of the US. And the intention there was to take these stories out from a very convenient box in which they had been placed earlier. That convenient box was that of stereotype and scorn. And Hurston wanted to present these stories in a way that would not put them down to simply misunderstandings or to a sort of stereotypical description of just things that poor black people do. Yes, they were things that poor black people were doing, but every utterance, every story had its own origin, had its own texture of feeling. And it was to that unique experience of how these stories emerged, why they were popular, why they were repeated, how they were passed on, and what meaning they continued to have for poor Black people in Hurston's time. This is what Hurston wanted to convey to her readers. And so, in the process, the stories explained a lot of things. Some of the things that the stories explained were things like why Negroes are Black. And one somewhat ridiculous and satirical explanation for that is that they misunderstood when God commanded, get back. That is, and this is the kind of humor that Hurston wants her readers to pay attention to and to simply accept for what it is without any judgment about intelligence or the complexity or the rationality or the humanity of the people who tell these stories and the people who believe these stories. So one story goes that God commanded the Negro to get back, and instead of understanding this response, it was misheard as get black. And so all the Negroes became black. Some more stories which Hurston discovered when she went on these. Hurston finds a chance to hear why there are no mockingbirds to be heard on Fridays, how the dog and the alligator ruined each other's looks, how the snake received the weapon of poison from God, how the woodpecker nearly drowned the world, how the possum lost his tail and thereby his spirit, and many, many more stories. They also told stories about elements of the natural world, about insects like ball weevils, about gnats, and about the mosquito. And some of these southern US states are quite hot and humid, and they are probably the only parts of the continental US in which one can find mosquitoes. So states like Georgia, Mississippi, New Orleans. In some of the southern parts of these states, one can find mosquitoes, and they are very dangerous and obviously quite irritating. Nothing new for people in India. Mosquitoes are very common, but in the US, they are not that common. And so there were particular stories of how mosquitoes came to be and why they exist from these folk tales that Hurston found. Hurston also heard stories that explained why cats had 9 lives, and which also helped explain why it's 9 years of bad luck if someone happened to kill a cat. So these are some stories, but the full collection or the full data set that Hurston managed to put together could not be published in Hurston's lifetime. And there are many reasons for this. She wanted to publish a kind of scholarly work, but she did not want to use a lot of contemporary anthropological theory. And so, struggling with several constraints, Hurston prepared a volume of stories which was titled Negro Folktales from the Gulf States. This manuscript was recently discovered at the Smithsonian Museum, and it had come there in turn after being for decades in a basement archive at Columbia University. Last year, this collection was published with the title Every Tongue Got to Confess, Negro Folktales from the Gulf States. Now, these volumes and these stories, there's one story that I just want to mention because it turns on the question of gender, and it also manifests a particularly unique writerly interpretation of what is commonly assumed to be a biological difference between the sexes. So there is a folk tale about which addresses the difference between men and women. And this folk tale is about why men are physically stronger than women, apparently, and also why men are intellectually weaker, or why women are able to win every verbal or intellectual duel. And in different versions of this folk tale, the speaker traces the origin to ancient times, to probably the first couple, and they happen to have a fight, and then the man prays to God, expressing his frustration as to why he cannot win every argument, and God responds, or I think man asks for some sort of an advantage or some sort of strategy or some means through which to win these contests. And in different versions of these stories, God gives this sort of gift. Sometimes God gifts the man, sometimes God gifts the woman. And the gift to man is, of course, physical strength, and the gift to woman is intellectual strength, or the ability to win arguments, if not contests of physical strength. And there are several folk tales in which Hurston presents these stories without any interpretation or judgment as to the rightness or wrongness of these sort of gendered assumptions. Whether it was a sign of civilizational triumph or whether it was a sign of civilizational backwardness, that such differences between the sexes were reinforced and consolidated through folktales. That's a question that Hurston does not consider very important. And it's a question that might occur to 21st century or even 20th century readers who have an awareness of the intellectual work of feminism. But this is not a question that is relevant to Hurston, who is collecting these folktales. And indeed, this was a criticism that Sterling Brown, an influential scholar of the Harlem Renaissance, also noticed when he wrote that Mules and Men is not as bitter as it should be, in order to get closer to the truth of Black life. For Hurston, this critique or the articulation of anger or laying down a vision for social change was less important than giving vent to a sort of wide eyed curiosity, wonder, and just interest in understanding, describing varied experiences and varied tales. Some of the expressions Hurston uses to describe the work of a researcher are formalized curiosity and poking and prying with a purpose. Anthropology, ethnography, fieldwork, we can then see in this moment how these things can be set to work as an instrument. These were the means that Hurston used to achieve the end, which was simply to produce compelling and powerful works of fiction. Hurston was less interested in getting a degree or getting the validation of the larger scholarly community. Hurston was more interested in producing narrative, producing work that compelled readers, that quickened the pulse of a person reading a novel. And in that sense, one could say that Hurston's plan worked because she managed to produce a novel that manages to hit all of those high intellectual points. Now, at the time that Hurston was struggling to get funds, and while she was between field trips and trying to reconcile different contradictory anthropological positions, Hurston reflected on what was the place of Black folk culture in contemporary intellectual life, and she wrote an essay about it titled Characteristics of Negro Expression. This essay appeared in Nancy Conrad's book, The Negro, which I mentioned in the previous lecture, and which, from a financial perspective, ended up as a flop, but which was an intellectual landmark because it brought together almost every well-known writer in 1920s America. And all of them reflected on this one question: what was the relevance of Black life and Black culture in contemporary American letters? It demonstrates how Hurston had come to think of Black folk culture as constantly in the making. And this, we can see, is the biggest intellectual idea that gives a very powerful form to her fiction. For Hurston, the intrinsic creativity of a people was something she would have thought much about after reading Franz Boas's book Primitive Art of 1929. In her essay for the anthology Negro, Hurston writes, Negro folk culture is not a thing of the past, and Hurston argues further that the folklore's great variety shows the adaptability of the Black man. Nothing is too old or too new, domestic or foreign, high or low for his use. God and the devil are paired and are treated no more reverentially than Rockefeller and Ford. Both of these men are prominent in folklore, Ford being particularly strong, and they talk and act like good-natured stevedores or mill hands. Old Massa is sometimes a smart man and often a fool. The automobile is arranged alongside of the ox cart. The angels and apostles walk and talk like section hands. And through it all walks Jack, the greatest culture hero of the South. Jack beats them all, even the devil, who is often smarter than God. Now, all massa is an expression. It comes from slave owning times. It's a black vernacularized way of saying old master. And all massa is a character that usually stands in for a white landowner, although historically the term referred to the white slave owner. In the folk tales, old massa refers to a rich white man, usually the owner of a business. And another version of that expression, old massa, is simply the man, although the man is used more in corporate and I think 20th and 21st century industrial and post industrial contexts. But both the expression the man and old massa describe from the perspective of the worker the interests of the capitalist or the owner. In these folk tales, that dynamic has a racial difference because Old Massa is white and the people who are telling stories about Old Massa are black. For Hurston, what's important is that Old Massa is evolving and these stories are also evolving. Although the stories emerged, or the language of these stories emerged when slavery was legal, the stories evolved through the Reconstruction era, through Jim Crow America, and they continue to evolve even today. And it is that perpetual change or that perpetual state of being in flux that Hurston's folk tales and Hurston's ethnography tries to get at with a very, very light touch. In fact, the touch is so light that one doesn't even know if the touch exists. But the point of these tales is to give readers a sense that that constant evolution is taking place. Now, I will now shift to the novel itself and read from the opening pages of the novel to give us all a sense of how all of these very powerful ideas, these stories, these contexts, and this history that shapes Hurston, how all of this finds its way into the novel. This is how Hurston begins The Eyes Were Watching God. Chapter 1. Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. For some, they come in with the tide. For others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. That is the life of men. Now, it's very strange that a novel that is going to be concerned with life and fate of one woman begins with a reflection and a declaration about some sort of a universal psychology of all men. So, and it's something to note about this novel that every chapter begins with an abstract statement. It's usually somewhat spiritual, but it also makes very powerful metaphors. So, the first sentence of every chapter, and I'll try to read as many of these first opening sentences as I can. I'll obviously not read all of them, but some of them. And this was probably the most powerful. So, what does the narrator want to tell us? The narrator is telling us something about the way the dreams of men work. It's a comment about psychology. It's a comment about the kind of striving that men are likely to undertake in their lives. And the point of describing this kind of striving is to set up what the novel is going to be really concerned about, which is the opposite or something very different from it, which is the kind of striving that women are likely to undertake. And this is an important challenge that the narrator sets up for herself because the narrator is not entirely sure how exactly a woman must go about undertaking that striving. Because it seems that men have that striving laid down for them, given certain natural or social causes. And what are these natural and social causes? Ships at a distance have every man's wish on board. Now, that sentence works on multiple levels. On one hand, it signifies the essentially low stakes or the essentially idle and essentially profitless nature of thinking itself. Because the ship is at a distance, anyone can project any wish that they want on the ship, right? But then it's about every man's wish on board. It says something about the public nature of men's dreaming, that men are likely to dream about things that have some consequence or impact in the public world, as opposed to women whose dreams of having peace or having satisfaction usually have or tend to have impact in not so much in the public world as much in the private world. Now, further, we are told that for others, they sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing till the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. So, there are two kinds of men. First, some who see the ships at a distance and think in one way. That is the one. What is that first category? For some, they come in with the tide. That is, whatever wish the watcher laid or projected onto the ship that is some distance away, that seems to be coming in, that wish is fulfilled. This is one category. The second category of the dreaming men is that for others, that is, those whose wishes are not fulfilled, they sail forever on the horizon. These ships sail forever on the horizon, never out of sight, never landing until the watcher turns his eyes away in resignation, his dreams mocked to death by time. So, some men have their dreams realized, and some men live in a constant state of dreaming. This is the two categories, and this sums up the experiences of men. Now, the second paragraph describes a different category from both of these two categories, which is that of women. Now, narrator writes, now women forget all those things they don't want to remember and remember everything they don't want to forget. The dream is the truth, then they act and do things accordingly. I'll stop there. I don't want to unpack this, but I'll invite you all to think about what this means. And essentially, it's a clue to how the narrator wants us to read the rest of the novel, which is about one woman recalling the life that she led, the decisions she made, and the consequences of those decisions that she's quite happy and proud to live with, even though many others around her don't quite feel that way. I'll continue with the discussion of this text in the next lecture. Thank you.